So, we've all heard of the New Deal, right? It was America's big shot at a comeback during the Great Depression. But here's the thing. By 1935, it just wasn't cutting it. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, he doubled down. He launched a wave of reforms so bold, so ambitious, that it became known as the Second New Deal. So yeah, let's get into it.
I mean, this thing created programs that literally reshaped the nation. We're talking about the roads we still drive on, the very idea of a retirement safety net. But it brings up this huge, central question we have to ask. Did this revolution really lift up all Americans?
And well, the answer to that is where the story gets really complicated and honestly really fascinating. It's a story of incredible progress and, at the same time, profound inequality. It really gets to the soul of America during one of its most transformative periods ever.
So let's back up a bit. Why did FDR even need a second act to begin with? What was going on?
Okay, so picture this. It's 1935. The Depression is still dragging on. Roosevelt's got a re-election campaign coming up, and he's feeling the heat from all sides. But, and this is key, his Democratic Party had just scored these massive wins in the 1934 midterm elections. That basically gave him a green light, a mandate to go even bigger, even bolder. It was time to launch a whole new set of programs that would totally change the game.
So the first part of this new approach was a direct assault on unemployment and a radical rebalancing of power for the average American worker.
And that brings us to the Works Progress Administration. You'll know it as the WPA. Now, this wasn't just some small, temporary fix. This was meant to be a permanent solution. Roosevelt himself said the goal was to employ the maximum number of persons in the shortest time possible. I mean, think about that. It's the closest this country has ever gotten to a federal jobs guarantee.
And the scale of it, just wow. The initial funding in 1935 was nearly $5 billion. To give you some perspective, that was an absolutely mind-boggling amount of money back then. It was a signal that the federal government was all in. And what did all that money buy? Well, the WPA's footprint was just enormous. You can see it right here. It built the physical stuff we still use today. Hundreds of thousands of miles of roads, thousands of bridges, new schools. But what's so cool is that it didn't stop there. It also funded the arts. We're talking public murals that are still around, and they even recorded oral histories, literally saving the nation's culture during its absolute worst economic crisis.
At the exact same time, the Second New Deal gave a massive power-up to workers, and this was truly revolutionary. I'm talking about the Wagner Act. For the first time ever, it gave federal legal protection to unions. The government was now officially picking a side, and it was the side of the workers who wanted to organize for better pay and safer conditions.
And you can see the ripple effect almost immediately on this timeline. The Wagner Act just unleashes this tidal wave of activism. The CIO is formed, and then you have these legendary victories like the sit-down strike at General Motors. It all leads up to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is what gives us the minimum wage we have today. This wasn't just a small change, it was a total game changer for organized labor.
All right, so that's jobs and labor. Now let's turn to the other huge piece of the Second New Deal puzzle. A program designed to create a safety net for Americans when they fall. Of course, I'm talking about Social Security.
You have to understand, back in 1935 America, the Social Security Act was a completely radical idea. It created these three core things that we just kind of assume will always be there now: retirement pensions, unemployment insurance, and direct financial help for kids and the elderly. The government was basically saying, you know what? Your well-being is now our responsibility.
But FDR was a really sharp politician. He knew that the idea of a government handout, what they called a dole, was super controversial. So, to get around that stigma of welfare, he insisted that Social Security be funded by payroll taxes, paid for by workers and employers themselves. That way, it felt like an earned benefit, not like charity. And that one strategic move, it made Social Security the absolute cornerstone of the American social safety net. It was the peak of decades of progressive work, and it's a program that, for better or worse, still defines our society to this day. Okay, so it all sounds pretty great, right? But this is where the story takes a really sharp, really difficult turn. Because that new foundation, that cornerstone of American life, it was built with some massive and very intentional cracks.
I mean, all these programs sound incredible on paper. A jobs guarantee, union rights, retirement for everyone. But it really forces us to stop and ask a pretty tough question. Who exactly was this New Deal actually for? And when you start digging, this jarring contrast just smacks you in the face. The promise was economic security for all Americans. But the reality?
The reality was that huge groups of people were systematically, deliberately left out. This new foundation of social welfare, it was built right on top of America's existing inequalities, and in a lot of ways, it just poured concrete over them.
For Black Americans, the New Deal was often a raw deal. The NRA pay codes, they locked in the lower wages that Black workers were already getting in the South. The AAA, it ended up pushing countless Black sharecroppers right off their land. And maybe the most devastating part, Social Security was specifically designed to exclude farm and domestic workers, which just so happened to be the jobs that a majority of African Americans held at the time.
So, why? Why would they do that? Well, it all came down to a cold, hard political calculation. To get his New Deal laws passed, FDR absolutely needed the votes of powerful, white, segregationist Southern Democrats. He knew that if he fought for civil rights, like pushing for a federal anti-lynching law, his entire coalition would collapse. He even told the NAACP, flat out, "I just can't take that risk."
And this quote from a Mississippi newspaper at the time, it just lays the racism right out in the open. Southern politicians were terrified that if Black workers had economic security, they wouldn't be a source of cheap, exploitable labor anymore. And that fear directly shaped the Social Security Act, making sure millions were locked out of its protections.
And it wasn't just Black Americans. Women also got a really limited deal. The whole system was basically designed for a male breadwinner. This created what historians call a two-tiered welfare state. You had federal benefits like unemployment and retirement that were tied to a formal job, which back then overwhelmingly meant men. Women, especially single moms, were often pushed into less generous, more invasive state-run programs that came with a heavy social stigma. It made it incredibly difficult for them to gain any real economic independence.
So what we're left with is this really complicated dual legacy, right? It was a moment of incredible, forward-thinking progress that also managed to write exclusion into the very DNA of our government.
You know, it seems like Roosevelt himself kind of understood this. When he signed the Social Security Act, he called it a cornerstone in a structure which is being built but is by no means complete. He knew it was just a foundation, a starting point, not the finished product.
And that leaves us with the question that, honestly, we are still wrestling with today. The Second New Deal was a monumental achievement. It created the American social safety net we know, but its creation involved this cynical political bargain that intentionally left millions of Americans, especially Black citizens and women, on the outside looking in. The structure was built, but it was incomplete from day one. So the question for us is, what does it take, all these decades later, to finally complete it?